So Carl, I'm going to have you do the same thing our last panel did and just talk to the audience a little bit about 10,000 Villages, what it is and how it works.
Yeah, thanks. So 10,000 Villages, we have this audacious, maybe crazy belief that some of the poorest and more marginalized, most marginalized communities of the world can be successfully transformed and served through commerce. And not the kind of commerce that's going to exploit the people, but the kind of commerce that's going to empower and lift them up. So for over 70 years, we've been facilitating a marketplace in North America for artisan goods from over 28 countries, and through that period have moved about $140 million in sustainable income to these communities around the world.
So I think one of the key parts of that people are really interested in is the idea of commerce that does not exploit, but actually helps and lifts up. What does that look like? What are you looking for, or how are you thinking about structuring that?
Yeah, so we follow a fair trade model that actually was kind of developed. 10,000 Villages was really, we call ourselves sometimes the original fair trader. We started in 1946 with our founding, kind of pioneering founder, Edna Ruth Byler, who is a woman from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who started bringing needlepoint back with her from Puerto Rico and selling it out of the trunk of her car or out of her basement. But over time, that developed, and you start having to create, you take something that starts as this really simple idea, and you've got to start creating processes and systems and principles by which you're going to operate as it expands. And so over time, that developed into what was then the alternative trade movement, and then finally the fair trade movement. And so we operate by principles that really are seeking to be ethical and to kind of turn the business model on its head, where we focus first on the maker and asking the question, what is a fair price and what is a fair wage for that maker. So our model, we follow the fair trade principles that we actually helped develop as a founding member of the World Fair Trade Organization, which is really, we have 10 principles. I'll just highlight a few of them. One of the key points to this is that support of the maker, of the artisan. So we pay, and removes the risk actually from the artisans, that we're sustaining a lot of the risk, or holding a lot of the risk. So we pay 50% of our purchase order at the time of the order to help fund and finance the production of the materials for the artisan. Kind of a micro-finance, micro-funding kind of process through that. We pay the remaining 50% when we receive the product at the port where it's leaving, so at FOB. So we hold the risk during the import process while it's being shipped. Some other things, we ensure that there is a fair price being paid. We negotiate that. It's a face-to-face transaction with the maker. We make sure that there's a fair, livable wage that's being paid, which can get complicated, and there's always questions around if you're absolutely doing that 100% right, but we do the best we can to ensure that there's a fair, livable wage being paid, that there is no forced labor, no child labor, that there are safe and fair working conditions, and so on. And the other piece I think that's really important to our model is the relationship that's involved. I actually just got back yesterday from Guatemala, where I was visiting with some of our groups in that country. And it's really amazing to be able to sit down and talk with the people that are making your products, to be able to discuss design ideas, complications that they're having in production, and work together to achieve those. So relationships important, and also then the time of that, the long-lasting nature of it. There's a risk that somebody comes in, buys a lot of product one year, and the next year no product. So we have a real strong commitment to consistency of purchases over time. Many of our groups we've been purchasing from for over 30 years.
Right. You mentioned Guatemala. I'm wondering where else 10,000 Village has a presence. Yeah,
so we're in 28 countries. A lot in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, that region. We have a number of groups in both West and East Africa, Central, South America, really almost every corner of the world.
Right. So as somebody who has covered labor markets, specifically the global labor market, quite a bit, a thing that I get told a lot is that it is just not profitable to do some of the things you just talked about, to pay a fair wage,
Right.
to do a lot of these things that would take the risk and put them on the company versus putting them on
Right.
the person making the goods. I'm wondering how you respond to that and how 10,000 Villages has obviously been able to buck that.
It is. Yeah, we are a nonprofit organization too. I would mention we're organized as a 501c3 nonprofit, and it's incredibly inefficient to do business the way that we do business. My background is more in banking and finance, and so I remember the first time, and I was kind of new to the fair trade concept, and when I was being introduced and asked if I'd consider this opportunity, I looked at financial statements, and I said to someone, well, here's your problem. You're paying this 50% up front in advance to your makers. You shouldn't do that. That's not really good. They said, Carl, that's the whole point. I said, okay, so certain things are non-negotiable, and I get that. But yeah, it's incredibly inefficient, and so it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I think it's what counterbalances that, though. Again, to go back to this kind of relationship piece and the relationships and the community that grows out of our stores, out of our supporters, out of our customers that are really kind of supporting the brand in that way. I think we get a lot of leverage and mileage out of that. So we work together with a lot of different partners who are kind of aligned with us, in terms of our model, in terms of our mission, that support that. But it's a challenge. There's a lot of things that we wish that we could do, that we can't do. So, kind of keeping up to speed with retail trends that are changing, by the day, by the hour, sometimes is challenging for us. But we kind of find a way to make it work.
I was actually going to ask you a little bit more about how you keep up with those retail trends. So if you don't mind giving us a little more detail on that.
Yeah, so I mean, like any other retailer, we subscribe to trend services, and we whether it's colors or other types of fashion trends, we talk to others, of course, in the industry. And the real challenge for us then is communicating that and engaging with our makers around the world to communicate those trends. And that's one of the things that they find most helpful, right? Because they want to be able to make a product that is saleable in our markets. And so we're able to provide some of that information, some of that trend data to them, and work closely, our designers, our buyers, working closely with them to help, develop, design a product, produce a product that's able to be sold and meets consumer demands here in the United States.
I'm wondering how the behavior of consumers when it comes to fair trade goods and just general knowledge about global supply markets and these issues has changed over the years. When I think about, the term fair trade, I think it first came into, my awareness maybe 10 years ago, and has been something that I've thought about and cared about since then. But I'm wondering, is this becoming something that consumers, at least American consumers, are more aware of, and how does that affect 10,000 Villages?
Yeah, I think there's an awareness. I mean, there was a time at which I tell people we were fair trade before fair trade was cool, right? Nobody knew about fair trade when we were doing it. And we've actually started, we still, and we proudly kind of wear the badge of fair trade, but we recognize that some of the ways in which it's being used with certifications and other types of things, and in industries different than ours, where we're producing mostly gifts, personal accessories, as opposed to in the food service area. I think there's always questions about what does fair trade really mean. In fact, there was an article I think the AP ran a few months ago that was talking about that. How do I know something? If somebody's saying it's fair trade, how do I really know that's fair trade? So we've been kind of using the language also about what it really is. So instead of just putting a label on something, talking about what we do, talking about the advance payment, talking about what ethical sourcing means, talking about the relationships that we have. But I think consumers have this growing desire for transparency, for authenticity. They have a growing desire to have a purchase that involves more than just a transaction. That maybe that there's an impact that they can have, that they see, especially kind of the rising generation, I think is seeing that there's a purpose behind the transactions that they make, and they can change the world, if you can be so audacious to actually say that, through the choices that they make and being able to live out their values in their purchases. And then also, I think this idea of being able to, of connection and the desire that we have for connection, I think that's another trend that we talk about. And so we're able to, involve the maker actually at an equal level in the supply chain, right? And to be able to then connect the consumer directly to that there's no, you know where your product came from because I talked to them. I talked to the women in Uganda that were weaving the baskets. I talked to the women in Guatemala who were, sewing the placemats or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Logistically, can you talk us through how you get product from some more rural locales where you have makers and into the hands of consumers?
Yeah, it's really tough.
Yeah.
Especially given the infrastructure restrictions in some of those communities. So in fact, and I hate to keep going back to my trip, but it's so fresh in my mind because I just got back. Was visiting a group in Chichicastenango, Guatemala, and you kind of come along the road, we park our van, and then we've got this dirt road that is at it's not at a regulation grade, let me just say that. It's pretty steep, and about a half mile you're walking down, and you can see in the rainy season, there's no way that you can get up and down that road. But then you get to the bottom of the hill and you turn the corner, and there's this explosion of color with these beautiful fabrics that are there waiting to be used. So getting those to that is incredibly challenging. I think, and also given some of the issues in country if there's political unrest, again, natural disasters, all those types of things are obstacles. So it's really, and it makes it hard for us to work with some groups. There's just some groups. Africa's incredibly challenging kind of for that reason. There's a limited number of ports. You've got some interior kind of landlocked countries, and the cost of getting that material, those products, to the port makes it very difficult for us to be able to then include that cost and price the product at a level that's acceptable to an American consumer.
Right. I want to let the audience know that we are going to take questions on this panel. Most of you were here for my spiel last time, so I will just remind you questions, please, and not comments. So I'm wondering, a lot of retailers who are not non-for-profits have recently kind of gotten into the idea of going to some of the same locales, working with citizens there, and then bringing back those goods and kind of marketing it under a similar umbrella. I'm wondering if you find that ultimately helpful, harmful, hopeful?
Mm-hmm. I think it's great. The idea is that we want more money going into those economies and to those people, and any way that kind of happens. I talk about sometimes some of our success stories. We've got a group that we've been working with in Peru for about 30 years when they were just starting, and they're at the point now where last time I was meeting with them, they said, Carl, we're selling, less than half of our product is being sold to you now. And I said, well, where are your other fair trade vendors? Where else are you selling? Well, some fair trade, but actually our largest vendors are Crate and Barrel and the Body Shop. And so they're going in. Now, the difficulty with that, however, and I think why the reason that, and that raises a question, so is there still a need for 10,000 villages doing the kind of work that we do? Well, there is for a couple reasons. One, because not all groups are able to scale and build the kind of capacity to address the kind of demands coming from those types of buyers. Similarly, I guess those vendors, and I'm glad that they're doing this kind of work, but they don't necessarily have the same commitment to that sustaining consistent purchases over time. So we had a group in India that I was meeting with recently that was explaining that one of those retailers came in, placed a big order. They scaled up, added 50 people to one of their workshops, and that worked out great for 2 years. and then the order dried up, and it was gone. They've got now this excess capacity, and how do they deal with that? So I think it's kind of a two-edged sword. I think it's great. It raises awareness. It does provide additional income to those areas. I also think, but I don't think it addresses the whole picture, and especially with the smaller groups that really just don't have, the capacity. A lot of the groups that we work with, we're able to work with because of some historic relationships we've had with sustainable international development organizations. We were actually birthed out of the Mennonite Central Committee many years ago, and maintain a relationship with them. And they've got people on the ground, and they do a lot of the skills training and the capacity building that really helps. And so we're able to work with some of the groups that otherwise might not have access to markets through those types of vendors.
I want to potentially come back to that. I want to see if anyone in the audience has questions first.
Good morning. Karen Shunk from the Object Management Group. You were talking about the emphasis on the maker, but that you also try to monitor trends and communicate that information to the makers to make their lives a little easier in terms of determining what they would make for the market. And I'm just wondering, since I assume you do have a particular type of consumer in mind, are you attempting to learn from them specifically what they're interested in, and then kind of trying to produce things specifically for your consumer market, through communicating that to the makers? And how can you do that when you're facing certain inefficiencies in logistics and other production?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, it was just received some. And this was kind of a newer investment for us. Again, we don't have a lot of excess. In fact, we don't have any excess capital that we're working with. But we just invested in some more consumer research so that we're able to identify, who is our, both our current customer. With honestly, our legacy customer is aging, and they're buying less stuff now. And so, we're in the process of making, as a lot of brands are, making a transition to that kind of next generation of consumer. And so, we've been really focused on identifying what it is that consumer wants, what that consumer needs, so that we can communicate that to our producers. In terms of how, again, it's just a lot of relationship. It's a lot of face-to-face. One of our buyers, so one of the groups I was with in Guatemala, gave an example of how one of our buyers, showed them a new technique on some of the sewing that they do in order to hide the seam better, so that it fits more of kind of what a trendy kind of product would look like here in the States. But that takes time and to develop that. And so a lot of our time from design to actually getting something in the store is considerably longer, I think, than most other retailers. It's on average about a year from the time that we're first talking about a design to the time that we can actually get it in the store.
I think I saw another question right back there.
My name is Anthony from Union Kitchen. My question is, do you find it difficult to convince people to pay a premium for fair trade products?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is difficult, and so part of, I think, what our challenge is ahead of us is educating those consumers about that, because we've got this mindset that the cheapest product is the best product, or the product that that's what I'm going to. Even when I was in the market last week, somebody has a. So I'll step back for a second. I was at one of our producers, and I bought a poncho for my son, really nice, and they priced it, told me how much they would sell it for. It was the equivalent of about $11, which is a great deal, right, for us. Thanks to a pretty strong dollar in Guatemala, that was the case. I go to the market the next day, and even there, asked how much a very similar looking product was, and they told me it was, again, the equivalent of about $5 or $6. Now that's before I even started negotiating with them, which is what everybody assumes that you're supposed to do when you go to the market. And so it raises that question of somebody's not getting a fair shake in that, right? And so, I think one of our great challenges, and where a lot of our focus is right now, is indeed on educating the consumer to help them understand what the impact really is, and what a fair wage is, what it takes to live in some of these economies and what the impact of our purchasing decisions and our expectations around pricing have on these individual communities.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Carl for joining us.